Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
I'm Jill, the host of The Nourished Child. Let me ask you something. Do you wonder if your child is getting all the nutrition they need? Or do you feel unsure about what's going on with your child and their eating? Feeding kids is hard. I've raised 4 of my own children, and as a pediatric dietitian who works with kids and families, I know the job of nourishing and nurturing our children is a big one, full of emotional swings, frustrations, and worries. That's why I created thenourishedchild.com, the ultimate parent resource for children's nutrition and feeding. There, you will find free articles, e-guides, and programs to help you better understand your child, food, your own feeding, and their eating. Check out The Nourished Child today. Head to thenourishedchild.com. And now for the show. Today's episode is sponsored by Knobs Jr. Kids Toothpaste by Biome. Knobs Jr. is the perfect toothpaste for your little one. Made with just 10 ingredients, Knobs Jr. Kids Toothpaste safely polishes teeth, remineralizes and strengthens enamel, fights tooth decay, and prevents plaque buildup. What more could you ask for? Learn more about Knobs Jr. Kids Toothpaste and get a 15% discount on your first tube of Knobs Jr. by going to www.betterbiome.com. That's BETTERBIOM.com and enter the code NOURISHED. That's www.betterbiome.com and code NOURISHED. Don't delay. This offer ends on November 16th. Hey friends, Jessica Setnick is the best kind of dietitian. She knows her stuff but doesn't take herself too seriously. Jessica mixes a fascination with human behavior into her expertise in eating disorders with a splash of experience as a stepmom, and the result is an eye-opening new way to think about eating. She brings the same combination of personal and professional experience, plus a sense of humor, to the table when talking about the challenges and pitfalls of feeding kids. Jessica has books, articles, workshops, and workbooks to her credit. Still, her greatest professional pride is when a friend tells a new acquaintance, quote, "It's okay. She's the kind of dietitian you don't mind eating lunch with." Find Jessica online at jessicasetnick.com. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the show.
Hello. So happy to be here.
It is awesome to have you here. We're going to have an interesting conversation today, I am sure. But before we get started, the audience that listens to this show is mostly parents, professionals, pediatric professionals also. And I'd love for you to describe in your own words the work that you do today and the work that you've been doing pretty much throughout your whole career.
Sure. So we have to go a little bit before my career to the fact that I studied anthropology in school and so came to nutrition. It was my first career, but in school I took it just as an elective. I didn't know I would fall in love with it. So that anthropology major has informed everything I've done as a dietitian. And I don't know that I knew what anthropology was before. So I'll just share for anyone who doesn't know. It's just the study of human development on a big picture level, humans as a society, basically. And so nutrition to me is about the development of each person on a very micro level. So it's really anthropology in the sense of studying why someone develops the way that they do and the choices that they make and what societal influences are on them. And so that's the lens that I bring to nutrition, is that smart people don't do unhealthy or unproductive things unless there's a reason. And if we can find the reason, then sometimes we can help someone change if they want to. So there's my background before my career. And then my first job was as a dietitian in a hospital, children's hospital that was starting an eating disorder program. And when they started it, there were 2 patients. And when I left, they had to replace me with 5 dietitians. And that's because we were the only eating disorder program for all of North Texas, which is a huge amount of people. And it was the best possible education I could have had in eating disorders. I learned so much about for example, that anyone can have an eating disorder, that it doesn't care what background you have, because there's a community or county hospital. So we saw every kind of person there. And it also gave me a lot of insight into the parenting side of parenting someone with an eating disorder. Then I've been in private practice and I've worked for eating disorder treatment centers. And now I work for myself, and I don't see clients individually, but I run an eating disorder nonprofit for dietitians that helps people get insurance coverage. And I present, I speak, just like you do, on my area of expertise. I do private trainings for hospitals, and I have a professional training course called Eating Disorders Boot Camp. And through that, I supervise, I do consultations with dietitians and other professionals around the world. So that was like a very fast wrap up of 25 years plus as a dietitian. But this has been my focus area the entire time is eating disorders, and especially eating disorders in kids.
Yeah. And which is wonderful. And I took your eating disorders boot camp, probably back in 2006 or 2007 when my youngest was going to kindergarten, and I was like, I'm going into private practice. And so that really helped me get ready for a practice that saw at least a third of my personal private practice population were eating disorders in children. So
I'm so glad it helped. And my personal stance is that as dietitians, we need to treat every patient that we see as if they may have an eating disorder, because a lot of people aren't aware that what they're doing is really a problem, or that they also would benefit from mental health care. There's just so much to it that we as dietitians spot first, because we are talking about food and eating.
Yeah, that's so true. So I know that a lot of parents have questions around the genetic backbone or the genetic propensity for an eating disorder versus the environmental structure that might support or encourage or persuade the development of an eating disorder. Can you talk to both of those topics,
Sure.
genetics versus environment?
Yes. And I'm just going to make it less binary, because it's not, of course, like anything, and nothing is as simple as just genetics or environment. But I'm actually going to change the wording, if that's okay with you, to biology-based eating disorders, because there's more than just genetics that's in the biology area. So for an example, you can have a completely genetically based eating disorder, and that would be if there is a gene mutation. So not necessarily inherited, but a gene mutation that causes a disruption, let's say, in someone's ability to feel full. There's one example is Prader-Willi that people may have heard of, where someone never feels full. Other examples are things that don't actually become known. So for example, PKU, let's say, is a genetic mutation that we test for at birth. There's other genetic mutations that you don't know until later, which is a little bit confusing, because you think if I have a genetic mutation, I would know right away. Well, I have no idea what is going on with my genes. We just aren't aware of that. And sometimes they don't show symptoms until we go on that first diet. And then once we start getting malnourished, some of those gene mutations start to show, and they cause eating disorders. And that's why if we can prevent our kids from ever going on a diet, we can prevent some of those biology-based eating disorders that don't become prevalent until someone restricts their food intake. So there are also biological causes of eating disorders that are not genetic. And that would include things like a concussion can cause an eating disorder to develop. Concussion is really just a brain injury, right? So if the part of the brain that detects hunger or fullness, or is, recognizes that food is safe, becomes damaged, then someone can become afraid of food or not be aware of their hunger and fullness cues and either not eat or overeat. Another example would be PANS, which is pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome, which is a really big mouthful. And that is when a child develops an eating disorder after some kind of illness, viral illness, and that can include COVID, unfortunately, although there isn't a lot of literature out there. There are some case studies that suggest that COVID can cause an eating disorder. So there's a lot of things that could cause an eating disorder that are completely out of our control. And in the biological area, I would also include things that are known to increase risk. They don't cause eating disorders, but they are connected. Things like ADHD and anxiety, depression. The research suggests that 2/3 of people with anxiety eat when they're anxious, and 2/3 or 1/3 don't eat when they're anxious. So it's not a direct line, but it's simply that it shows us that anxiety affects food intake, and that can then trigger an eating disorder. And then anything biological that requires someone to change their eating, food allergies, celiac disease, diabetes, those are biological factors that can lead to dysfunctional eating behaviors and an eating disorder. And so some of those things that I mentioned have a genetic piece, right? So perhaps celiac disease runs in a family, or diabetes runs in a family, or anxiety runs in a family. So I think of those as having a genetic component, but it's a bigger picture than just what's in someone's genes. It's the genes interacting with the environment, right? So therein lies the biggest mystery of eating disorders. Is even if we could find a gene, which we won't find a gene, it will be many genes. But even if we could find a gene that related to eating disorders, there's very little chance that it is a guarantee that someone will develop an eating disorder. We do know that if a family member has an eating disorder, that there is a higher chance that someone in their family will develop an eating disorder. But we also know that if someone in a family has alcoholism, then there's a higher chance to develop an eating disorder. So we know that that can't necessarily be learned behavior, right? You could think, well, you could learn dysfunctional eating habits, but you don't learn an eating disorder from someone with alcoholism. So there is definitely something genetic there for some people. And then you go all the way to the other side, and there are people who have probably, the environmental system. I'm thinking of a recent dietitian that I consulted with who described a family eating situation that was, I mean, in my mind, I thought the dog in that family would have an eating disorder. I mean, it was so disruptive that there's no way that anyone could have a good relationship with their food, or feel that they, could follow their hunger cues or fullness cues during that meal, or not have bad feelings leaving the meal, even if the bad feelings have nothing to do with food. So to me, there are terrible environments that can cause dysfunctional eating behaviors. I suspect that everyone listening to this podcast probably doesn't fit in that category. I would think that if you're listening to a podcast on child feeding, you probably have an interest in that area, practicing that in your home. But there is the blend of the environment that is outside the door. So as neutral or positive as the eating environment is in your home, there's the diet culture pool that we're all swimming in. And that is a danger that we can't protect anyone from. We have to instead arm them, put armor on them to help them be ready to face it. And so the environmental factors outside the home, to me, are a huge problem, because essentially what they tell me is, or the way I piece it together from an anthropological perspective, is that because of the environment that we live in that is so negative about food and eating and bodies, so destructive about all those things, that we're going to max out the genetic potential of the human race for eating disorders. In other words, there are people who live in diet culture who never develop eating disorders, but anyone who has the genes is probably going to develop an eating disorder, because the environment is so target rich for things to cause an eating disorder. And so that's where parents come in and can help protect kids from that environmental stuff, even if we can't protect from their own biology.
And for parents who are listening out there, when you say environmental factors outside the door, what are you talking about? Are you talking about school, social media?
Yes, all of the above. I'm talking about bad advice people get from peers. I'm talking about terrible assignments at school, even in young kids, early readers. I've gotten calls about an early reader that just slammed food for no reason. The whole book was about how mom went on a diet and started eating salad and then ate a whole cake. I mean, ridiculous stuff. It's just trying to teach kids to read. Why is that the topic? Or assignments, even where little kids have, a page of food, cross off the ones that are bad for you, things like that. So there's stuff that kids are purposefully taught that is negative. And then there's just the things that we accidentally encounter: billboards about diet products, advertisements on TV, other people in the world who are on diets, who are talking about their diets. I don't object to anyone eating a special diet, but I object to them talking about it around kids or flinging it onto kids or telling kids what they should or shouldn't be eating or criticizing what a child brought in their school lunch or in their lunch from home. So that's the world I'm talking about, is the everything in the environment. And then of course there's social media once a child is old enough to access that. And the problem with social media, of course, is that it feeds you more of what you are interested in. And so it's not like turning on the TV and there might be one advertisement for weight loss in an hour-long program. Social media is like, once you watch that one commercial for weight loss in that hour, you now get another hour of just weight loss information. And so that's where social media can become really destructive, because there is no other point of view or even neutral point of view. If you are looking at that kind of thing, then you just get more and more of it.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned arming your children. Yes. Let's dive into that a little bit. What are you talking about?
So what I'm talking about is preparing your kids. So when you see a diet commercial on TV and your kids are sitting with you saying, oh gosh, I wish there weren't diet commercials on TV. They make people think their bodies aren't good enough. And we know in our house that our bodies are just right. That's the kind of thing that we need to do, is we need to sort of demonstrate, not just tell, but demonstrate how we are implementing the sort of all bodies are great at any size. We don't criticize other people's food. For example, if there's a family member who's a food pusher, and you know what I mean? Like someone who's like, you have to eat more, don't you want seconds, or that kind of thing, that we can just say to them. And it's important to say in front of the child so that the child learns the words. It's important to say, oh, you know what? In our family, we don't make anyone eat anything they're not hungry for. And those are the kind of things that you do. And this is just going to sound like a tangent, but I just read recently something about teaching your child to say, when your child hits you, to say, no, I don't let anyone hit me. So instead of saying you're bad for hitting me or no, we don't hit, you say, I don't let anyone hit me. And so by that, you're demonstrating what your child should say should anyone ever hit them. And so it's kind of the same thing. Is really demonstrating so that your child can then parrot your words if ever that were to happen to them. Let's say it's someone else's house, they can say, oh no, in my family, we don't have to eat anything that we're not hungry for. And so you're empowering your child with the words and with the assertiveness to do that. And it's hard to do sometimes in your own family unit, but I'm sorry, not your family in your home. It's sometimes hard to do in your family of origin, right? Where everyone sort of has their ingrained behaviors that they've done for decades. So you start in your own home, but then try to enhance. I can't think of the right word, but try to make it grow, enlarge the circle of where you are assertive slowly but surely. And whether that is in a school setting, and say to your child, if your child comes home and says, well, the teacher said that I shouldn't have brought these Teddy Grahams to school in my lunch. And you can say, oh, okay, well, I don't agree with that. So I'm going to let your teacher know that Teddy Grahams are part of your lunch. And so you're just neutrally explaining how you are going to advocate for your child. And then they learn through that, okay, I didn't do anything wrong by bringing Teddy Grahams. My mom is going to take care of it, or my dad is going to take care of it, or my caregiver is going to take care of it. And so we're giving children that feeling of safety in the world, and teaching them the skills that they will eventually need when someone directly confronts them about their eating.
Yeah. Advocacy for your child, but also I think activism too. And I think that parents, as our culture evolves and we evolve with our kids, I think activism is going to be sort of the next step for a lot of parents because, as you said, there's just a lot out there that children have to navigate, and they're not equipped to navigate. And they need not only advocates, but I believe some activism needs to start to happen with parents who are doing this on a larger level, not
Mhm.
just protecting their children, but protecting the children that their kids are interacting with, right?
That's a great point. Great point. And I don't know if you have something like this on your website, but anyone listening, there are dietitians in North Carolina. Their website is Sunny Side Up Nutrition. And
Yep.
they have on their website, they have information about sort of what kind of letter can you send to the school if they do something inappropriate. And then this year I heard something, or this summer, I heard something that was for the first time. It was the idea that instead of waiting for your kid to have some kind of terrible interaction or detrimental assignment and then go to the school about it, what about getting in touch with the school in advance and saying, hey, I'm a dietitian. I've heard about these things happening in other schools. I'd like to try to get ahead of it and make sure that we're not doing any of this. And a parent could do that too. You don't have to be a dietitian, but just say, listen, I'm very concerned about negative food messages. I think our kids are really at risk. And I wanted to make sure that this is something that the school is addressing in advance, not necessarily talking to the kids about eating disorders, but how are we talking about health and nutrition to kids? Are there any assignments that kids have to do where they track their eating? Do you weigh kids in this school? Like getting ahead of it and identifying what are the sort of problem areas that could happen. And then who is in charge of that? And if the school says, well, we have no say, we have to weigh every kid. Well, who mandates that? Who do I go to next? And and it might be the state legislature, but how do you get to the whoever is the decision maker? And we even have dietitians in my organization that are working with the CDC, which puts out some of this guidance. And we have a law, we're trying to enact a law that the CDC has to keep track of eating disorders or start to assess for eating disorders in all their assessments, which is kind of shocking that they don't do. But nevertheless, the CDC is who puts out the curriculum for health classes, I believe. And so trying to get to that higher level, absolutely. I think it's very appropriate to make a change for everyone rather than reacting to what happened.
I, on the show, interviewed Kendra Sonneville, and she's a researcher and does a lot of work with eating disorders. And she eloquently sort of expressed a spectrum of eating dysfunction to eating disorder. And I thought that was a helpful way to showcase it for parents, because I think parents are very fearful of eating disorders. And I think they conjure in their minds this extreme, right? The end result of an eating disorder, be it anorexia or bulimia, and they get very nervous about that terminology. And so one of the things that strikes me as we're talking about this is so many of the things in the exterior environment that we were just talking about seed dysfunctional eating, which are the beginnings of an eating disorder, correct? Not that I have a question, I'm just observing that.
No, that's okay. I'll explain my stance. I prefer not to use the words eating disorders at all. Honestly, I prefer dysfunctional eating behaviors because eating disorders are a humanly created diagnostic terminology. And so there's been a lot of problems caused by that because human beings don't fit into boxes. And so the diagnoses are created by humans, fallible humans. Until 1986, the only diagnosis of an eating disorder that you could get was anorexia nervosa, because that's the only thing that had been studied for a century. And not only that, but if you weren't a slender, white, affluent girl, then you were never going to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa because that's the only people that were studied. Yet there are so many other eating dysfunctions and there's so many other types of people who get them. So I just ignore the eating disorder label completely when I'm in my daily life and talk about dysfunctional eating behaviors, because dysfunctional to me doesn't say you don't eat enough or you eat too much. It says whatever you're doing is not working for you in your life. It's not moving you closer to your goals. It's moving you away from them. It's causing problems for you. And so dysfunctional eating behaviors works great for me. You could call it disrupting eating disorder or eating behaviors if you want, if that's an easier kind of term to wrap your mind around. But disruptive eating behaviors just simply means problems are happening related to eating or not eating. And so that's the terminology I prefer. And then when you put that on a spectrum, it becomes easy to see that you can have disruptive eating behaviors that are sort of minor, and then you can have disruptive eating behaviors that are life-threatening. And that's the spectrum. So I would say the life-threatening behaviors are where we would say, oh, someone has an eating disorder. But why wouldn't we intervene when someone has disruptive eating behaviors at a lower level? Why would we wait until they have an eating disorder? Why would insurance require a diagnosis of an eating disorder in order for someone to get care when we all know that the whole point is to prevent it from getting to that life-threatening level? So that's the way I think of a spectrum. And I probably would have a lot in common with Kendra, even though I don't think we've ever met.
Are you looking for a kid's toothpaste that's fluoride-free and strengthens their enamel while being gentle on their teeth? Introducing Knobs Jr. Kids Toothpaste by Biome. Knobs Jr. is made with just 10 ingredients and comes in a delicious natural bubblegum flavor. Natural sweeteners like xylitol and stevia offer a great taste and make brushing fun while promoting a healthy oral microbiome. You'll find nano-hydroxyapatite, which aids in remineralizing teeth for stronger, healthier smiles. Most fluoride-free toothpaste brands use 2% nano-hydroxyapatite, but Knobs Jr. uses more, 5% in fact. Knobs Jr. was designed by a dentist with your little one in mind. It's safe for developing teeth and gums and cleans gently but effectively with no harsh chemicals. Learn more about Knobs Jr. Kids Toothpaste and get a 15% discount on your first tube of Knobs Jr. by going to www.betterbiome.com. That's BETTERBIOM.com and enter the code nourished. That's www.betterbiome.com and code nourished. Don't delay. This offer ends on November 16th. And that just actually, I'm reading this book right now called Outlive. For better or worse, it's a book about, living longer, healthier. Okay. But one of the big premises of this book is very similar in that we know cardiovascular disease starts very early, yet we don't diagnose it till somebody has a heart attack. It's sort of the same thinking, like prevention of all of these things are things that are happening throughout our lives, are moving us closer to having a heart attack or not having a heart attack, having, life-threatening, dysfunctional eating behaviors or not having life-threatening.
Right. Well, and when you say it like that, that's when, we remember that there is a place on the continuum where eating behaviors are neutral. And then there's a place further down where eating behaviors are positive and supportive and moving you closer to your goals. So when I draw the continuum on a board, it starts with eating behaviors that are positive, then eating behaviors that are neutral. And as dietitians, we try to help someone who's at the neutral stage to go to the positive stage. For example, that might be an athlete who's naturally gifted, but if they ate in a different way, they could actually fuel their performance better, right? Or someone who's managing, but there's things they could change that could actually move them in a positive direction. And then there's people whose eating behaviors are, let's say, moving them away from their goals. And then there's people whose eating disorders are really harming their goals. And then there's someone whose eating disorders are really threatening their goals or their life, however you want to phrase it. So yeah, there's more to the spectrum than just the disruptive eating behaviors. There's the positive eating behaviors. And that's where we're hoping that if people can get help and intervention at the slightly disruptive eating behaviors, that we can push them onto the positive side and they never have to go down the path towards the life-threatening behavior.
Exactly.
I wish I had a whiteboard right now. I'd be writing on my whiteboard. Yeah.
Well, this will be documented. You can always go back to this. But
again, yeah.
I mean, I do think when we think about our profession and think about nutrition and think about where we are going, and this is not just, I know we're talking about eating disorders today, but this goes for other eating behaviors that lead us in the opposite direction, perhaps, towards medical concerns or conditions or diseases. And I think that way of thinking, which is more preventive minded, right? Rather than waiting till waiting till,
But you have to reverse engineer it then, because that's the part that I think is missing in a lot of medical care is when someone goes in and they do have, let's say, high cholesterol, or cholesterol isn't really diet altered.
No, that's not diet related.
That's not a good example. That's not a good example. But if someone, let's say someone I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good example, but basically what I'm trying to say is when people go in for medical care, very rarely do they get a referral to a dietitian to look at their eating behaviors. A doctor might, and this is unfortunately something that is in the environment all the time, that is another thing parents can be very proactive on is your pediatrician going to weigh your kid, and are they going to comment on your kid's weight in front of them? Because I would get ahead of that and say, call the front desk and say, listen, if this is what's going to happen, we're going to have to see a different pediatrician. I want to make sure that there is, this is not a topic of conversation. Like you can weigh my child along with taking their blood pressure and their heart rate and their other vital signs, but it's not a topic that's open for conversation at all. And so that's where I feel like, sometimes weight or weight change gets prescribed as a cure for things. And we know this from people who are going through life in a larger body and they have a sprained ankle, or they have an ingrown toenail, or they have strep throat. And they are always told to lose weight, whether it's related to their condition or not. And I feel like that is just it's a huge trigger for an eating disorder. I just spoke to the National Conference of Transplant Dietitians. And so weight loss is huge in their field. People are told to lose weight before they can get a transplant, all kinds of things. I mean, it is a life or death situation for some people. And some people are not going to lose weight. This is just their normal body size. And we cannot, restrict treatment to people only if they lose weight. But yet that's one of the things that is happening. And gosh, I already don't even remember how we got on this topic. Oh, I was going to say reverse engineering, that when someone is diagnosed with a medical issue, it would be nice if they also had a dietitian to assess how their eating is, because there may be things that could change or improve. But usually in my experience, it's only people who have diabetes that are referred to a dietitian, sometimes someone with celiac disease. But a lot of times what we do when we diagnose someone with a medical condition, food allergies, whatever it is without guidance, it can turn into a dysfunctional eating behavior because they're just given this very small piece of information, like avoid carbohydrates. Well, avoid is a very big word. I used to think that when I was in the hospital as an intern and I had to hand out those sheets that said, avoid this, avoid that. I would think, does that mean avoid being in the room with it? Does it mean not eat it ever? Does it mean only eat it sometimes? Like, it's really important that we find out what's going on in someone's life. If you told me to avoid Brussels sprouts, I would say no problem. I don't like Brussels sprouts at all. But if you told someone who loves Brussels sprouts, avoid Brussels sprouts, they're going to need some guidance on what they're supposed to do about that, right? And so that's where I feel like our medical system is missing is, like you said, we only diagnose people when things are severe, but we also diagnose people with things and then tell them lose weight or tell them change your eating, and then don't give them any guidance at all on how to do it. And so our medical system is actually creating eating disorders that wouldn't need to be there in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. And to mention that attaching weight loss as a solution for everything under the sun you're diagnosed with, that is a big problem. A big problem.
Enormous. Yes. I hate it. And I feel so sad when, I hear so many things from parents about how, one of my childhood friends was in tears because she said, I've worked so hard to protect my daughter from any kind of weight focus, body focus, negativity. And then we go into the pediatrician, which is supposed to be a safe space. And the pediatrician says something negative, whether it's meant to be snarky or whether it's meant to be useful, doesn't matter. It is unhelpful because of the lens of the child who is hearing it.
Yeah. What do you think about telling a child to gain weight? Do you think that has the same repercussion?
I think that doesn't mean anything. That's sort of like saying, make your hair grow faster. Weight is a normal body function that we have no control about. So telling someone to gain weight is no more helpful. If a child needs to gain weight, then they need guidance on how to do that, or their parent needs guidance on how to do that. Just saying your kid needs to gain weight is not helpful information. And just as a very simple example, I'm thinking of my office manager, Selena, who's worked with me for 20 years and has as much knowledge as a human can have about eating disorders and nutrition as someone who has worked alongside a pediatric eating disorder dietitian for 20 years. When she had her first baby, I guess it wasn't 20 years at that time, but when she had her first baby, she came to me and said, we had our first checkup and the doctor said that Mia is in the 85th percentile. Does that mean that I'm supposed to give her 15% more formula? Yes. So I'm just saying, right? And those two things are totally unrelated. But that's what I'm saying is I feel like medical professionals give information and don't check to see how it was received. Don't check to see how it was implemented. And if they're not going to see someone for 3 months, how can they? And that's why dietitians feel such an essential role, because we have the ability to see someone more often for a longer period of time, where we have more questions, where more trust is built. And we are the people that are supposed to investigate food and eating. So there's a little bit less maybe white coat syndrome of, yes, and then forgetting everything when you walk out of the room. So that's just a simple example of a very educated person who still didn't understand what was told to them at the doctor's office about their child's weight. So it's just so important to, I think, be ahead of the curve. And but there's so much for parents to know. And I think maybe that's something to keep in mind, is there's so much for pediatricians to know. How can they be an expert on everything from infant feeding to, STDs for teens? They can't. And so we need to really understand that as parents, we can't just trust, turn over all trust to our child's pediatricians. And that kind of leads to the AAP guidelines, which
So I just want to interject.
The dietitians, yes.
Yeah, I want to interject PSA. If you have concerns about your child's eating, look for a dietitian to help you. So let's talk about practice guidelines. We have practice guidelines for children with quote unquote obesity from the American Academy of Pediatrics. We also have practice guidelines from the AAP as well, and the American Psychiatric Association for children with eating disorders. I guess they're just coming out with a brand new set of practice guidelines in 2023. I don't want to parse out what these different guidelines say, but what I want to do is kind of explore, what are they getting right? What are they missing? How useful are these?
So
your opinion.
Yeah. My opinion is that when other kids label a kid or bully a kid because of their size, we call that bullying. But when a medical professional does it, why are we not calling it bullying? There is no sense in identifying a child based on their size and then saying that their size is a problem. If there's a problem, let's look for the problem. But like I said, a child's size is like a child's hair color. They can't do anything differently. And speaking of which, I do remember a patient with a terrible eating disorder who remembered sitting in church and her dad would look at her curly hair and say, why can't you have pretty hair like that other girl? What the heck? Right? That is the kind of thing that I feel like we're letting our doctors do to our child, is say, like, why can't you be skinny like those other kids? They have no control over that. This is their normal body size. And so that's where I think that it's just a huge problem to be labeling kids as overweight, because we don't know what is your standard for labeling them overweight. If you're comparing them to other kids, that's the worst idea I've ever heard. Maybe you could compare them to themselves. If you wanted to, I guess you could compare them to their biological parents. But it's such a negative message to say that someone's body is wrong right from a young age. It's just a terrible message. And so I have a hard time with the idea of the guidelines at all. If they said something like, these are the guidelines for when a child is abnormally gaining weight, maybe I could get behind it. But to say we're just going to label kids that are a certain size as problematic, a problem that needs to be solved, I can't get behind that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I wish they were, here are guidelines for children who are experiencing type 2 diabetes. It's a health condition that, of course, we want to help all children with, right? If they're having active health conditions, we don't want to let a child keep going with
abnormal growth. I mean, the weird thing is that there are kids that have abnormal growth, right? Let's just use, for an example, Marfan syndrome, right? Someone is growing abnormally tall. Okay, so we treat the Marfan syndrome.
Yeah.
But they're not labeled. They're not, or Prader-Willi, they're not labeled as your body is screwed up. Your body is wrong. Your body size is a problem. We have to somehow shrink you. Like it's so normalized in our culture to tell a person who is big, oh, by the way, you're big, and that's not good.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think we have to focus on the conditions, not the size.
Yeah. What if someone had told Shaquille O'Neal or Michael Jordan, like, you know what, you're growing too big. Like, this is really a problem. We got to get some medical care in here. I mean, how do you know that that person isn't the normal size for them?
Yeah. But I think that stigma goes towards younger, smaller bodied children too. There are a lot of children who are naturally petite and small, shorter, that also get bullied, that also have this stigma, that also walk through life feeling bullied and having that impact their self-esteem. And I think culturally right now, we focus a lot on the larger bodied children, but there's an equal impact, or perhaps not equal, but there is also an impact on children with smaller bodies, naturally smaller bodies.
Well, I agree that there is something wrong with looking at a child's body as some kind of denoter of who they are as a person, right? There's also children with disabilities. There's also children with any kind of, scars or acne or all kinds of things. And the idea that we will label a child is just so inappropriate. And I agree with you that when the outside person comments, that's one of the main things that we know that influences body image. Body image is very fixed from a young age. And I have patients, for example, that are adults that feel so big and they're completely normal size, if not underweight. And they can recall being the tallest girl in third grade or the first girl to develop boobs. And those things made them feel big and they carry that for the rest of their lives. Another example is, I can use myself. I'm a pretty short adult and, I was called shorty pants and I didn't like being called shorty pants. There's all kinds of things. I agree with you, but I do think that as a whole, it's definitely a bigger issue, I think, for people who are bigger. But I wouldn't disagree that on an individual basis, we all need help recognizing that we are going to look different and that's normal. And as some dietitians say, even if we all ate the same and exercised the same, we would all have different bodies. And why isn't that okay? And the reason is, if you think about it, if you really go into that anthropological depth, then the reason is because us not feeling good about our bodies is a great way to sell us things. It's really a feature of capitalism and consumerism, which is the soup that we swim in all day long. And so if we all felt good about our bodies, then no one could sell us anything to change our bodies. If we were all okay with frizzy hair and hairy armpits and, et cetera, then we wouldn't need razors and we wouldn't need special shampoo. And if we weren't afraid of aging, we wouldn't need all the face creams, right? So that's where making us unhappy with our bodies or with the progress of normal aging actually serves someone and it makes people money. And you may be one of those people that makes money on those things. And it's something to think about. Is that an industry that you want to be supporting with our dollars and with our work hours? It's a complicated issue. It's very ingrained in our society. And even if you're not going to quit your job in advertising, it's still okay to tell your child that you can't let advertising tell you how to feel about yourself.
Absolutely.
And that's really the root of it is if you think about all the time in the world that people didn't even have mirrors, people didn't even know how they looked, right?
Yeah.
So
or scales.
This is very much a feature of, 20th century. And it's also, we could go so in depth, which we won't today, but it stems from racism and it stems from classism and it stems from all kinds of things that we are trying to eradicate in society. And yet this weight stigma still persists. And it's really vicious. And that's why we have got to protect our kids from it. And I think any pediatrician that's going to label a 2-year-old as obese is not someone I would let anywhere within 40 feet of my child.
Yeah. Agree. Let's, for the remainder of our time, let's talk a little bit about social media and how it shapes our biases as parents, as professionals, right? We all have implicit bias, for better or worse, particularly as we've been talking about, around the areas of size, eating, and health. So is social media helpful? I mean, there are people, I personally have such a love-hate relationship with social media. If I didn't have to be on it, I wouldn't be on it. And I feel like I have to be on it because, I have a book coming out and there are certain expectations and blah, 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 blah. There are people, and I've done all the research for the book on social media. It is not good. When I got done, I was like, oh, I'm so glad I limited it with my own kids. But yet on the same, giving equal consideration. There are people that believe social media can be good for people, that there can be an effort to educate and to bring awareness and to help change the culture. So there's these both sides of this conversation, how bad it can be and how it can be something useful for change. What are your thoughts about how social media is affecting just those areas, shape, size, eating, health, how we think about those topics today?
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack for a minute and I'm going to talk about discernment. Okay, so when a child is very little, we tell them green means go, red means stop. Littler than that, we just tell them you have to hold my hand when we go outside, right? Or when we cross the street. But at some point we teach them green means go, red means stop, and that's it. As an adult, that, once in a while you cross on the red. If you see someone's in danger over there, you're going to cross on the red and you're going to get to them, right? Or if the light's been red for 10 minutes and nothing's happening, you cross on red. And sometimes you stop on green, right? If there's a car in the road, you don't just walk just because it's green. Or if a tree is blocking the road, you don't just cross because it's green, right? You use your discernment. But children up until a certain age don't have that discernment. You really have to learn it. You have to see it modeled. And so the problem I see with social media is it's something that children do independently before they have discernment. So if someone was scrolling on social media with their parent and the parent was scrolling through it with them and commenting and using that sort of assertive advocacy voice and saying, oh, goodness, I don't like this post. This post says that blah, blah, blah. You should be not eating after 2 p.m. or whatever it is. And they could say, oh, I don't agree with that. And the child, even with TV, we watch it together, not always, but with social media, it's so isolating that if you don't have any discernment of your own, it feels real what you are seeing on the screen. And so that's where I have a big problem with it, is that it's not something we do together where we teach our discernment to our child, where we explain why we look at social media or what it's not. So to me, and that I think that would be a very atypical family to actually scroll on social media together. But I think it would be an interesting experiment to, instead of checking your child's phone, to actually say, let's go on social media together. I'd like to see the kind of things that are in your feed because they're probably different from mine. I think that there's two types of social media in a sense. There's social media where you communicate with your friends. And there's negatives to that, right? You can find out that your friends went to a pool party and you weren't invited, and that can make you feel bad. So there's some of those things, but there's maybe more positives about connecting with friends, especially during the COVID period when people were very isolated. So there's benefits to social media with people you know. But there's the other kind of social media, which is people you don't know. And that kind of splits into two camps, right? The activists that you were talking about that are trying to educate. And I learn a lot from that. I follow people who are talking about things like racial disparities. And I was very miseducated here in my state of Texas as a teen, as a young middle schooler, about racial issues. And so learning from people who are outside my bubble is really important to me. But there's also the influencers, whether they're paid or not paid, it doesn't matter. They're spewing their information that may not have any biases, may not have any sources. It may be their own experience, which is fine to share your own experience. But if they're sharing it as professional advice, then to me, it's, again, we can use our discernment and say, like, well, this gal on an island in wherever that says she made $10 million in a week, my discernment tells me that that's not the way to go, right? Or that's whatever, that's BS. But a child, for example, my sweet nephew, who's looking at YouTube and seeing this person say, I made $1 million buying things at TJ Maxx and then selling them on Amazon, he actually believes that is true. And luckily, he has an aunt who's willing to go with him to TJ Maxx, buy things, list them on Amazon. And together we learned that does not work. And instead we had a yard sale. Okay. So But you get what I'm saying. It's like it's the adult intervention that is missing when a child is scrolling on social media all alone in their room and we don't know what it is that they're seeing. So that's the danger, is if we could just limit it to people that our child knows, there would still be bullying, there would still be drama, but at least the circle of influence would be the same people that child would interact with at school, with the same mean girls and the same drama that they would have if they were going to school with those kids. When you're talking about total strangers, would you let total strangers come into your home and try to influence your child? Either you would, and you would be right there with them, and you would be explaining to your child why we are not going to buy what this person is selling or go with this person anywhere, or you would just not let that person into your home at all. Yeah. And so social media allows these total strangers into our child's home with bogus information that we're not there to counteract. So that's the biggest problem I have with it.
Yeah. Well said and described and annotated. Well, I could talk to you forever, Jessica. I think you're such a wellspring of information and insight and wise advice. I thank you so much for coming on the show. And where can people find you or find your resources?
Sure. So my website, I'd love that. My website is jessicasetnick.com. It's my name. And that's where you can find out about bringing me in to present. You can find the books that I've written, which are mostly for professionals, just as an FYI. And also I do have one workbook that is for consumers. It's called Food Fairy Tales. And it helps you to identify where did you get the food rules that are in your mind, and do you want to keep them, evaluating if you want to keep them and pass them on to the next generation or not. It just sort of ties in all the generations and talks about how, we were a blank slate when we were born, but immediately the people who cared for us started transmitting their food rules onto us. And do we want to do that to the next generation, or do we want to change the way we pass things on? And what I can do is I can give you a discount code to put in the show notes that will bring the price of that workbook down to $15 for your listeners.
Okay. Great. That's awesome. Thank you so much. I'll follow up with you on that. But,
okay, great.
So nice to have a conversation with you. I so appreciate you and your work.
Thank you. Same. I feel the same way. Mutual Admiration Society.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.